the thing I can't overstate enough is like, it's entirely preventable. We don't have a solution for guys throwing 98 to 102 being durable for an extended period of time, right? It's such a small sample size. It's really hard to study that. But we know how to keep high school kids that are 84 to 86 healthy. Like the playbook is absolutely out there.
Hey guys, welcome to today's episode where I am thrilled to be sitting down with a true expert in the world of sports performance. This man's name is Eric Cressey. You've probably heard of him. Eric is the president and he is the co-founder of Cressey Sports Performance. They have state-of-the-art facilities in both Hudson, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston, as well as Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. On top of that, he serves as the director of player health and performance for the New York Yankees, bringing unparalleled expertise to one of the most storied franchises in all of Major League Baseball. But that is not all. Eric is also the host of his own podcast called the Elite Baseball Development Podcast. And believe it or not, he's authored over 500 articles and 5 books, making him one of the most respected voices in sports performance today. His work has been featured everywhere from ESPN and the Wall Street Journal to Men's Health and the New York Times. In today's episode, guys, we are going to dive into youth baseball development, and we're going to get into some really, really major topics that parents, players, and coaches all need to know, from preventing early injuries to creating long-term athletic success. Eric shares insights from his podcast, and he also discusses his athletic development pyramid and breaks down how young athletes should prioritize health and safety and strength in order to truly excel. Whether you're looking to help your child reach the next level or you're simply wanting to understand what it's going to take to thrive in today's baseball landscape, this episode is packed with invaluable advice. So without further ado, let's jump into the show with the one and only Eric Cressey. All right, so we are joined today by a man who does many things. Eric Cressey, you are the president and the co-founder of Cressey Sports Performance. You have facilities in, it sounds like both right outside of Boston, as well as Palm Beach Gardens. In addition, you are the director of player health and performance for the New York Yankees. And my favorite thing that you do, which I hope I'm the first one to coin this, you are the Andrew Huberman of sports performance. Has anyone told you that?
I haven't gotten that one before. Maybe it's because I don't have enough hair, but no, that's a good feather in my cap, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, no. So I'll tell you. So obviously, for people who don't know, you obviously also host a podcast, which is why I'm saying you're the Andrew Huberman of sports performance. And the more I've listened to your podcast, the more I kind of draw similarities where he jumps into really in-depth studies and different sorts of things. And I think not only does your voice sound the same, but I think you bring a lot of the same insight to some of these interviews. So for anybody who's listening who doesn't know who Eric is, you definitely have to check out his performance. It's called the Elite Baseball Development Performance. The thing that I kind of want to jump in with you just right off the bat is this podcast for me is really a passion project where I want to help a lot of these youth sports parents and players. Somebody who's been doing what you do for as long as you have, what's some of the things that you've seen? Because you've had athletes start as amateur players, stick with you through the major leagues, and even like into retirement. Talk to me a little bit about like some of the development or some of the trends that you've seen with these athletes, and anything that kind of stands out as like, this is a focal point that we really need to shore up and fix.
Yeah, I mean, first off, thank you for having me. I think it's definitely changed a lot. I mean, I finished my master's in 2005. And we opened our first facility in 2007. So, we're coming up on 20 years. The second location opened in 2014. So we've been in one facility close to 2 decades and another one a full decade. And we've also got to experience high school athlete development in Massachusetts, cold weather climate, versus athlete development in Florida, which is a warm weather climate. And, there's a lot of avenues I think we can go with this. But, first of all, the caliber of play has skyrocketed. The average high school player, it might be less refined baseball, but their capacity for performing at a high level is definitely higher, right? Meaning that the hitters hit the ball harder, the pitchers throw the ball harder. Like that has absolutely changed. In 07, when we opened up, if you were an 88 to 90 left-handed pitcher, you were a top 3 rounder. There was no question about it. Fast forward 7 or 8 years after that, we had 95 mile an hour left-handed arms that couldn't get a job in pro ball at times. So the caliber of play, everyone's seen the velocity, kind of linear improve every year in professional baseball. It's happening at the amateur ranks as well. But that could be a good thing or a bad thing. I do think it's good when the caliber of play increases. I think we see a lot of like showcase ball where kids can't field their positions, don't run the bases effectively, all that. So that's probably a separate conversation. But I think the biggest concern is the quality of play, the really, really specialized aspect of the game that's increased, the velocity, the ability to like design pitches and compete against velo and the machine, all that stuff. It hasn't necessarily been supported by a concurrent increase in physical preparation. Meaning, what we really did is we took this athletic pyramid where there should have been this foundation of strength and mobility and work capacity that supports a lot of these higher level initiatives. People just flipped the pyramid upside down. We played a lot more baseball. Guys threw more throughout the year. So, we got a lot of hyper specialized kids. And unfortunately, we also got some kids, kind of per your podcast that you did with Dr. Meister, which was awesome. Kids that were broken at a very young age. So nowadays, when you look at these like 17 and 18-year-old elbows that, are already throwing 92, 93, or even harder than that, they're all demonstrating these areas of calcification on their ligament where they have these low-grade injuries that kind of become this point of weakness on, unfortunately, what's a tiny ligament that's a limiter to high-level performance. And then often these kids get, in college, they get to pro ball, they continue forward in their athletic career, but they've got this structural defect that unfortunately becomes a big problem. So I think where youth development has really gone wrong is we've gotten away from a long-term perspective on how to develop kids with a sequential development. And unfortunately, I think a lot of it is really happening the most at the young level. And we're probably seeing more injuries in professional baseball at the highest levels because of it. So it's a very challenging time because there are a lot of people who have, their hands in the money pool trying to capitalize on it with showcases and, travel ball teams that just play throughout the winter. What I can tell you is Massachusetts, it was easy to develop arms, right? What happens in Massachusetts, you basically have a season that starts the third Monday in March, and you spend the first 2 weeks shoveling snow off the field. They basically play through, early to mid-June, and then, they go into whatever their summer ball program is. And then in the fall, if they even want to play fall ball, by October 15th, it's too cold to even field the baseball.
Right.
So you kind of force this off season. Kids go and play a fall sport up until Thanksgiving. It wraps up there. You start your off season throwing program, around, November 25th, December 1st, whatever it is. And you have this gradual on-ramp, all the way up through the start of the baseball season. So it's very easy. Down in Florida, there's a high school coach in Florida, not far from our facility, that runs fall workouts for 75 kids at once. I don't even know if it's legal or not, like in the school's gymnasium. So they lift, they do baseball activities 6 days a week, all the way up until Christmas. And they basically get 2 weeks off before the season starts, whatever it may be. They literally have a 50-week calendar season. It's just, you can't develop globally. And, it's hard because it's a program like that can have good outcomes from a wins and loss standpoint, simply because they get so many kids. They're a giant school district. And unfortunately, a bunch of those kids are going to get cut or, be put on JV. And, it's kind of like a survivorship bias, I think, that happens. And unfortunately, those are kind of the tricks that, parents and kids either fall for or they're forced into. They really have no way around it. So we've been kind of paddling upstream, trying to fight the good fight for a long time.
Well, I think you talked about so many different things there, and I think that encapsulates it perfectly, because I think this problem is so overwhelming. I think about it, and when you're in the business and you're seeing it firsthand, it's different than if you're, let's just say, a parent who's heard about it but hasn't necessarily seen it in action. I think probably with both of us, as we've not only been in it the last handful of years, we've been in it over 20 years. It's alarming and it's concerning. You talked about the pyramid, and if you could go a little bit more in depth about that, because I'm familiar with it, and I think it brings a really, really good point to the forefront. Walk these families and players through kind of what this pyramid is, what are each of the levels, and what's the problem?
Yeah. So you think about the foundation would be strength and mobility, right? You have to have range of motion and control of that range of motion, the ability to get into the positions that matter. And I think we can both agree, you take one of those 6'3", 160-pound sophomores in high school, right? These kids that have just gone through this massive growth spurt, right? Their center of mass has come up further away from their base of support. Have them go out and take 3 hours of ground balls and then see how their low back feels the next day, right? What happens is they have a ton of stiffness through their hips. Maybe they don't rotate effectively. They don't understand how to get into positions. So what they do is they throw all that stress onto their spine instead of having it be shared across knees, hips, ankles, all these other joints. They can't get into those positions, and they certainly can't get there and be powerful, right? Like they want to be. And then just as importantly, they can't do it for an extended period of time. So we talk a lot about strength and mobility kind of being the foundation. Once you have that, then you start to develop more power, right? And then you start to develop work capacity. Power is just how quickly you can apply force. So I always joke that if you have this empty glass, the glass is your strength, right? That's the kind of the foundation for everything. And as you want to put more athletic qualities in, you fill up the glass, and eventually we get to more advanced athletes who are very strong and they need to focus on other things. But in the youth ranks, kids need to put on some good body weight. They need to get stronger. They need to work on their mobility as they grow through these growth spurts. And then eventually you start to talk about things that are far more skill specific, things like building pitch count, obviously working on pitch design, understanding how to plan your competitive year. And then you get to this, higher and higher level, and you obviously can do a lot more of this nuanced stuff. What we see very often though, is you see the 15-year-old kid who's never set foot in a weight room, who finds like an aggressive throwing program, online, and he's rolling it out there, and it makes no sense. It's like doing calculus before you've even taken algebra. So we always just try to backtrack. Sometimes, to be honest, it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole, where in the youth ranks, like kids are just trying to do so many different things that are specific, that there's just something new that hurts each week. And it really is a pretty surprising things. And the thing I can't overstate enough is like, it's entirely preventable. Like this is not like we don't have the solutions. Like, don't get me wrong, at the major league level, like we don't have a solution for guys throwing 98 to 102 being durable for an extended period of time, right? It's such a small sample size. It's really hard to study that. But we know how to keep high school kids that are 84 to 86 healthy. Like the playbook is absolutely out there. It's 100% more about, enforcement, adherence to principles. There's actually a good study that just talked recently about something like 89% of high schools don't even pay attention to the pitch count regulations. Like it's a big problem. So, this isn't like, something that's a really, really challenge. It's not like cancer, right? Where we don't have a good solution for it. So early detection is the name of the game. Like in this world, it's really just follow the things that we know absolutely work at the youngest levels.
Well, and I think that's why we have to continue having these conversations, because so many of these parents and players, they go through the showcase ball, right? And they're chasing velo. Let's just say a kid's hit 93 and now he's like, I need to hit 97 in the next 3 months. Mm-hmm. And that becomes his focus. And what I love about your pyramid is what you've described is that everybody is turning this thing upside down, which is if the top was pitch design, they're kind of focused on that before they've really created the foundation. So Eric, as far as what you guys do as an organization at Cressey Sports Performance, if I'm a kid and I'm a junior or senior in high school, let's just say it's a summertime going into my junior, senior, maybe sophomore year as well, and I'm looking to work with you. I don't live in Massachusetts or Florida. How would it work? Can I call somebody at your organization on the phone, and do you got walk me through, if I'm somebody new, how that would work?
Yeah, it goes both ways. We have folks that will come in and do like a short-term consult, where they'll get evaluated. They'll go through kind of like our whole barrage of tests. Obviously, we'll have conversations about what they've done, where they want to go. And we might do, a 3 to 6 day crash course where we teach them as much as we can. And then we'll, watch over them while they do our programs back in Minnesota or wherever it may be. We also have a pretty built out, like robust online training setup that just helps give people direction. I think that's particularly important in areas that don't have access to a lot of resources and things like that. In that developmental world, though, I have gotten more and more objective in it. I think in the past we'd look at a kid and we'd say, you're 6'3", 175 pounds. Of course you need to gain weight and all these different things. But nowadays, more often than not, I spend a lot more of our evaluations like trying to figure out what guys' superpowers are. Some of these guys are very springy, elastic. Some of them are hypermobile. Some of them are just like short, squatty, and strong. So you never want to take away somebody's superpower in the way that you train them. You always want to leverage it and continue to help them, be better and better because of it. So I think I'm a little bit more aware of that. But what I like to do, we do, a lot of jumps on force plates just to kind of give people some objective measures. We have certain things that correlate well with exit velocity, other things that correlate highly with sprinting speed. And what's nice is we have kind of like this whole data set we built out of major leaguers. So I can take a high school kid and be like, you're literally in our 5th percentile for what would happen. Like, you're the weakest of our pro guys right now. That's not a fault of yours. It just tells you exactly what you need to work on. We have some guys that are strong, but they don't apply their force quickly. So you can look at the outcome measures. You can look at the shape of their curves. And then we also do a lot of rotational testing, Proteus, just to look at, we see a lot of kind of what we call sagittal plane beast guys that are very good for, for jumping and sprinting. But when it comes to rotating, they aren't super efficient. So, and then we layer all these things on top of range of motion assessments, obviously injury history. I can't tell you, like, when I do one of these consults and someone comes to town with elbow pain or shoulder stuff, like, a lot of times, like, there's, referral to a physical therapist or orthopedics or whatever they need to really get the true answer that's necessary in their situation. So I think it's a little bit of a different roadmap for everybody. So that's why it's, I'm lucky we built out a really good team to just kind of help me work through a lot of these challenges when I face them.
If somebody who doesn't live in either area can't get to Florida or Boston to maybe do the consultation, do you guys have relationships set up throughout the country where, like, a kid can go and, a local facility and get the testing done and then work with you remotely?
Yeah. And we can do a lot of it remotely too. But that's the case. And that I send folks out to other facilities all the time. Like, there's some good people around the country that do an excellent job. So I'm very big on, like, rising tide lifts all ships. Like, I'd love for our industry to be held to a higher standard and to really help a lot of kids, because we both know baseball is a tough sport to keep kids engaged in, right? You watch, I have 3 daughters that are playing softball right now, and it's a slow moving sport, right? There's, practices can be a little tricky. There can be a lot of standing around where you work on situational defense, first and thirds, things like that. That's not nearly as engaging as playing, tennis or lacrosse, where the action is really, really, like, nonstop. So I really think it's important for us all to work together to try to figure out how to keep this game going and leave it better than we found it.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
That is helpful. And I'm assuming that's going to be helpful for people listening. I want to kind of touch on a recent podcast that you did. And for anybody listening who wants to go check it out, it's the 7 Reasons Young Athletes Don't Make Long-Term Progress, which I love the title, obviously. And that was what was intriguing and why I listened to it. You told a story in that podcast about your 2 daughters, right? And the twins. I know you have 3 daughters, but this was the twins. And I'd like you to tell this story because I think it's a very, very good point you're making, which is, there's this comparison game going on oftentimes in youth baseball where Johnny down the street is comparing himself to some other kid who, not only are they unrelated, their body types are different, their maturity level is different, they could be different ages, and how dangerous that can be. So would you mind kind of just telling that story really briefly and what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah. So my wife and I she gave birth to our twins back in the fall of 2014. And I think when you don't know what to expect, you talk to other twin parents and you obviously get feedback of, like, keep them on the same schedule, all these different things. But I wasn't prepared for how much you have to consciously be aware of not comparing them. And I think every parent naturally compares their kids to other kids, but when you have twins, you get the lesson so much earlier. So for context, Lydia and Addison came out. My wife is Lebanese and Italian, so she kind of has the olive skin. I'm Irish, English, Scotch, and German, so I am a sunburn waiting to happen. Addison came out pasty white like her dad. Lydia came out olive like her mom. Even on the ultrasounds, like when we went to see them, Lydia was like face pressed against the glass and heartbeat like jumping through my wife's skin. Addison was like hidden in the back. We did one of those like face ultrasounds. All we saw was the bottom of her foot. She was just like the low key kid all along. They came out and they couldn't have been more different. Like Addison, like I was always the one holding her when she was little because she was like super easy. She'd like fall asleep on the floor. Lydia was like always needed to be rocked. She was like hyper vigilant. We tried everything to get her to sleep. They get a little bit older. Lydia walked faster about like 7 months before Addison. She walked at 11 months and Addison was way further along. Growing up, Addison left-handed, Lydia right-handed. Lydia is like crazy gymnast. Like she can't walk through our house without doing 5 cartwheels. She goes all the time. Addison would just love to sit in a corner and read a book for 4 hours. They're hyper different. Like they play soccer, Lydia's running around the field, Addison's staring at the field next to us. So, we were blessed with, an athlete and what appears to not necessarily be an athlete too. And we love them both the same, and it's amazing, but you really have to like catch yourself in not comparing them. And I see that so often in athletic development, is like parents that are trying to keep up with the Joneses and, well, this guy's doing this, should I do that? And we both know, I mean, sure, if you go through your client roster and just the players you've interacted with, it's the big league is full of late bloomers, and not just like,
Absolutely.
Weren't maybe great high school players that figured it out later. I mean, Steve Cishek's one of my best friends. They live in our neighborhood. Our kids play together. And, Steve played, 13 years in the big leagues, or at least parts of them. And Steve didn't get a single Division I offer. He went to Carson Newman, which is a Division II school in Tennessee. And, basically grew 6 inches as a freshman, learned how to work hard, found his faith, and left as a, fourth rounder 3 years later. Like there's so many stories that are like that. We see guys that are in the big leagues that, didn't play Division I, just really had to work at it. And it clicked much later on. And I think we also see players who, there's an unlock, right? Maybe it's a seam orientation or something like that. They developed Mariano Rivera, right? Found a cutter. We have to take such a long-term perspective because you never know when an athlete's just, a month or two away from some kind of unlock. So I always am really, really aware of that. And, we know of very few like Little League All-Stars that were also Major League All-Stars. Like I think that's been
Of course
about a lot every time there's, the Cooperstown stuff every summer, but it is a real thing. And I think one of the reasons it happens is a lot of those kids that are really skilled and ahead of their peers in the youth ages are the ones that get overworked, right? Everyone has the kid who was bigger and stronger and taller than everyone else in their hometown. He had a good curveball and he threw absurd innings in Little League, and no one ever heard from him again, versus the one that took a little bit more of a long-term perspective. Maybe they played multiple sports, they didn't have the injury that set them back. And those are the ones that ultimately became the best athlete in the history of their town.
Well, and what I think about is like two ends of the spectrum, right? One end of the spectrum is the kid who is willing to do anything and everything and truly takes that to another level, right? Works out 6 days a week when maybe that's probably not a good idea at 11 years old, right? Just is willing to do whatever it takes. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is, let's just say, the kid who maybe just takes it too easy and says, it'll happen when it happens. And I feel like through education, it's really helping everybody understand like there's a balance between both. And so if we get into the kind of the sports training component of this for a moment, walk us through what your thoughts are on, what's the proper age for a player to start training? Is it, is 10 too young? When I was a kid growing up, I remember for some reason it was like 13 was the number that everybody just said, but I don't think it was based on anything.
Yeah. I think it's entirely arbitrary. And the thing I say, first off, we can throw out like the idea of like strength training stunting growth. It's not a thing, right? Dr. Avery Feigenbaum at the College of New Jersey has done incredible research and published a lot on this. Is like a lot of those were just old wives' tales. Like I always tell this story, like your collarbone, your clavicle, it doesn't become skeletally mature until about age 25. But you don't see people like running into Division I football weight rooms and telling people not to bench press or run into people because you might stunt the of a clavicle. So I think all of that is largely been dispelled. Unfortunately, old myths kind of die hard. So for me, I'll tell you this, I think more is caught than taught. And our daughters have come to the gym with mommy and daddy since they were, infants, like literally in like their, basically in their car seats. So they've grown up with it. And what we always did was we never pushed it. But over the years, they'd be like swinging from the TRX, they'd be hanging from the pull-up bars. They'd put each other on the sled and like kind of drag each other around on the turf. They were doing strength training when they were just playing, right? And we see kids that, they carry heavy backpacks. They jump out of trees. Every time they sprint, it's probably 6 to 8 times body weight and ground reaction forces in single leg stance. So when you talk about going in a weight room, it's an inherently controlled environment that is actually probably safer than anything they can encounter throwing a baseball, sprinting and changing direction, whatever it may be. So I've always looked at it that way, but I've never forced it because I always wanted to create a favorable lifelong relationship with exercise with our girls. And I didn't want to get in the way of fostering that. So what I will tell you now is we have twin 9-year-olds, and like my wife will go and take like we have like a kind of a boot camp type thing that we do every Saturday morning, mostly for like players' wives and girlfriends. And my daughter Lydia and Addison both got up and went with my wife to do it on Saturday. And they do what they want. They kind of goof around off to the side. Some of it's running, some of it's throwing med balls. There's some kettlebells and dumbbells and cables, but they handle it just fine. And I think it's probably something that's important. There's a community aspect and all of that. It's all executed safely. So I don't have an issue with kids getting into it early on. I think it generally works really, really well when like we've done like foundations programs. Usually they're like 9 to 12-year-old little brothers and sisters of our older athletes that really want to get involved. I think 11 is a great age because you're trying to find the balance of when they can actually kind of be adherent to a program and mature enough. But at the same time, you don't want it to be too regimented when they need more free play. So we'll have some like 11, 12-year-olds that'll come in and start doing, a couple days a week, light stuff, just technique work. And we're kind of setting the stage for them transition to stuff that's a little bit more structured at 13, 14, 15 to 16, maybe it's 3 days a week. And then 17, 18, they can get on those 5 or 6 day a week, kind of true off-season programs we might have for a college or a pro guy. So that served us well. But one thing I'll say is Mike Boyle is a good buddy of mine. Mike has been in the industry for a really long time. Won a World Series with the Red Sox, has won a national championship with BU hockey, and he's worked with the women's national team in hockey as well. And he's always had a really good perspective on long-term development. But he talked about his own 2 kids, and both of them became college athletes. And he said that the smartest thing he did was they averaged 2 lifts per week from age 11 on. So you look at 11 to 18, before they headed off to college, 7 years basically of twice a week. So you look at, basically 104 sessions a year times 7 years. That's, 700 and change sessions that took place over the course of time. And you realize that maybe at 11, it was once a week. Maybe at 18, it was 5 or 6 days a week. But over the course of those 7 years, it averaged out to twice a week. And it definitely seemed to serve them well. So I've kept that in the back of my mind as I've kind of loosely planned my own daughter's development without being too overbearing.
Yeah, it sounds like when you start these kids off, and assuming it's at 11 years old, you almost want to start more generally, right? Let's just teach the overall body movement stuff, and then eventually getting to the place where it's way more specific. Maybe it caters more towards not only your sport, but your position.
9 to 12, you should be able to train tennis, golf, baseball, football, everybody together. And maybe your overhead athletes, you obviously mix in some extra like rotator cuff stuff and things like that. But in that early stage, it should be very kind of homogenous from a programming standpoint.
That is something that I think is missing nowadays with the specialization. So many, and I think, I don't know if it's the tournament organizers or the showcase ball that forces these players into this only playing one sport thing. But like when I grew up, I played 3 all the way up through high school.
Yep.
And I think on some level, playing hockey as a kid helped me with baseball eventually and football. And so I don't know, I get frustrated sometimes with these kids, not at them, but more about just like, I get bummed out that they're not going to have the experience that a lot of us had growing up, really, because you're almost guilted in a sense into like, oh no, you have to focus on baseball because guess what? Now it's year round. And if you don't do this, you're going to miss out.
Yeah. I even say, you said 3 sports, but I think also when we were growing up, like you had way more opportunities to like, we played like pickup street hockey. We played,
oh yeah.
We had like 3 months where we played rugby every Sunday afternoon. Like we didn't even know how to play rugby, but we went out and did
We
it.
played outside. Yeah, we went outside.
Yeah, it wasn't the manicured experience that it is today. And not only that, like you look at, physical education in schools, like I was in some gym classes where like we played full contact indoor soccer. We sold out for the dream, even when we had our own like athletic events in the afternoon. So it really was like, there were days where it was 3+ hours of like unorganized, wiffle ball, basketball, whatever it was, whatever we had the bodies to play. So it's just totally different now. I see it in travel ball where you have kids that go and like play for other teams. They get off their flight at the airport, they go in there, throw 2 innings, and they leave before the game ends. Like that's not how you develop players. It's not how you develop people.
Right.
There's another layer to that, but it's absolutely happening, unfortunately. So we got to get back to like that developmental era where kids were exposed to a lot of different things. And to me, maybe it's a provider induced demand, but I think that's where why I pick strength and conditioning in part is we can give them multifaceted development. They can do a lot of different things in our world. We can effectively train around some of the other craziness to give them that broader experience.
Do you guys, Eric, like, well, I know you're involved in this, but like, talk to me a little bit about the nutrition side and the sleep side and things like that. Like, how do you implement that into some of your work?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is you have to make it a regular conversation. What's actually interesting, I was looking into some Andy Galpin actually just had a really good podcast about sleep. And one of the things that he talked about was like the single most important thing you can do to improve an athlete's sleep is to talk about it. Just tell people it's okay to extend your sleep. If you're short, you're a Major League Baseball player that, had an overnight flight coming back from the West Coast. Like it's okay to sleep until 11. Don't feel like you got to get up at 9. So, sleep and nutrition, I always talk about is they're upstream strategies. The more you can think upstream, the more benefits you're going to get elsewhere. Like I can invent a great new training technique or give you some new piece of equipment and it might give you outcome, but I know that if you eat better and you sleep better, everything is going to get better. You're going to be more pleasant to be around. There's a lot of different factors that play into it. So, I think the hard part is though, it's mundane and it's boring, right? It's not sexy to talk about sleep. Nobody gets excited about nutrition. If you look at the most successful nutrition coaches out there, they're ones that they've done a great job on social media. They've made nutrition a little bit sexier because it's not a pleasant conversation to have necessarily, but it's so important. So when I talk about these things with athletes, I always tell them, don't wait around for someone to teach you something that you already know. In other words, you should sleep more. You know that sleeping, 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. is not optimal for athletic performance. So, in those contexts, there's a million things you can look at. I'm a big believer in chronotypes. We do have morning people, we have night owls that need to manage sleep differently. So with your morning people, every hour of sleep before midnight is worth, 2 after. So you've got to get into bed. That's how I'm wired. For your night owls, you got to give them a little bit of strategy to kind of creep it up a little bit more where, if it's 2 a.m., can we get it to be midnight so that we can buy a little bit more time? And then that's a lot of sleep hygiene stuff, figuring out ways to make your room colder, make it darker, get away from electronics, try some blue light, glasses. And then, looking at can you integrate naps somewhere in their schedule to kind of help that along? And also, can you find periods of sleep restoration where if you're not good during the school week, can you get a nap every Saturday afternoon to play a little bit of catch up? We do that a lot with major league players who have newborns at home. They love road trips. It's just a chance to catch up on that. And then on the nutrition side of things, that's a harder one to generalize because some people, are super nuanced and they're really, really in depth on it. They're looking for, food allergy testing and stuff like that. And you have other kids that don't even know what a protein or a carbohydrate is. So it's a little bit of a tougher discussion. But I think in general, on the young athlete side of things, it's understanding how to eat, hydrate, frequently enough and get enough calories in to support their activities. So I actually think I have a podcast. Dan Rosen did a guest podcast for me all about high school athlete nutrition. That's one of our most popular ones ever. So we always encourage
perfect
to do that. So I'll find the link for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll put it in the show notes. So as we move on from sports nutrition and the strength training stuff and we get into arm care and things. So on this podcast I was referencing, you mentioned various studies. There was one that stood out to me, though, this Japanese study done by, I think it was Okamoto in 2016. Can you talk about this study?
Yeah, for sure.
So,
it's mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yeah, just go in. Yeah, I was going to say go into it because I have some points I wanted to kind of make, but I think it's probably more beneficial for families to hear it from you directly. So can you talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So, just for context, we talked about a little bit earlier on that, effectively you have a lot of broken ligaments at a young age. And I'm actually pulling it up while we're talking because I want to make sure I speak to the exact numbers. So this is a 2016 study. They looked at Japanese boys and girls aged 9 to 12. And what was actually interesting is they excluded kids from this study who actually had elbow discomfort at the time of the study. So those people were pulled out, but they kept in kids that had a history of elbow issues, but didn't have symptoms at the time of the study. And what they did was they took all of these kids who were asymptomatic and they imaged all their elbows. And again, these are 9 to 12-year-olds. And they found that 42% of the players had UCL damage on their MRI, and it's 63% of the pitchers had it. So they were at 9 to 12 years old. They were already
That's crazy
structural changes. And don't get me wrong, you see these not to this degree in their American counterparts. So it is becoming more of a thing. Like this may have been the case when we were younger and there was like that one kid in our town that was throwing way harder than everyone else. Like that may have been in play, but I think we both agree, like, I mean, actually today is the 50th anniversary of the first Tommy John. But I didn't know a single kid in my high school, my state, that had Tommy John. I graduated high school in 1999. I knew one kid who had an ACL tear. He was on our soccer team and he had an awkward collision, but I just didn't know that this was happening. It didn't exist back then. The game was probably played at a very different level. But then you go into the actual details of the study and they looked at the average training hours per week. It was 12 hours and 48 minutes. So you do the math. What's that? 2.5 hours, 5 days a week or something like that. But the standard deviation on that was 5 hours, 18 minutes. So you had kids in this study that were playing baseball for 19 plus hours per week between ages 9 and 12. Like that's really hard to do when you think about the Japanese educational curriculum. Like you're looking at basically logging 3 hours, 6 days a week and then some in some of these kids. Like you can't go out and throw a baseball for 3 hours. Like I go to my daughter's, gymnastics practice. They can practice for 3 hours because they like do a pass, then they talk about it, and 10 minutes later they do something else. It's a very broken up thing. In baseball, it's just throw, hit. So it's pretty insane that they're subjecting kids that young to it, and it's obviously why we're probably seeing more of these structural changes so young.
So is the takeaway for you? I mean, we can generalize and just make assumptions. What is the takeaway for you with that? Is it just we have to scale back the amount of time in the gym? I imagine what that also is including is like it's throwing and working out.
I don't think that even included workout. That was baseball's.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was literally just baseball activity, which, I mean, not surprisingly, I think in general, strength and conditioning is far less accepted in Japanese culture than it is here. And so it's pretty eye-opening that that's happening. But yeah, that was just baseball skill training. And it probably lines up with when we, every spring training in Japan, we hear these like stories of like this, heroic 800 pitch bullpen where, a catcher sat there and caught, for 3.5 hours or something. But it's just a very different world over there. And there are elements of that are in play in American baseball as well. There's, I can't speak to how much they do it throughout the year. I would assume it is also year round. But here, when you have kids that are playing baseball 50 weeks a year and then getting a quick break for Christmas and New Year's, like it's not a good long-term viable strategy.
So for anyone listening who didn't catch what he said, I think it's interesting because there's these Japanese players, I think, have this reputation of, over in Japan, they're throwing these 100 pitch bullpens like on the regular, right? And then they come over here and it's like, we obviously do things differently. Spring training looks differently. So, my mind goes in a million different directions. I'm thinking like, all right, are they trying to, they love throwing? Do they think they need to groom these athletes in a certain way? I've actually gotten curious about these Japanese guys when they come over here, because if I'm an MLB organization and I'm watching any one of these guys who throws like that come over here, there has to be a concern of like, well, wait a second. He's been doing it this way for so long. We think he needs to scale back. What's the concern that we would have if we do scale him back, and what does that look like? So I know MLB organizations have a ton of different people in place to kind of study this stuff and provide expert guidance. But just from my perspective, as I think about it, that would certainly be a concern coming over to the States.
It's a big one. The thing I think that, it's one thing to talk about like the training and, obviously the familiar with the culture and food and all these different things. But I think what we really overlook when those players come over is they all throw on a 7-day rotation in Japan. Like you come here, it's 5 day, maybe a 6 day. If you go to the bullpen, it's a very unpredictable schedule. So to be honest, I don't want to sound condescending. I kind of roll my eyes when I hear that like a college has very few injuries. Like college baseball, it's like, if you want to give a guy a weekend off, you can buy him a 15-day IL stint, right? Like it's very easy to do. They play, a couple games on the weekend and then a midweek game. Like it's not hard to support that. Like Major League Baseball calendar is like nothing, like nobody gets it. I'm sure just from talking to your guys, like sometimes it's even hard to figure out what time zone they're in, but they're playing 162 games, but it's when you throw spring training postseason on top of it, you're talking 200 games in 230 days. They're traveling time zones. Like we had a day in the 2022 season in the lockout where we came out. I don't know if you remember, they shortened the All-Star break because they had to make up the two series they missed on the first one. So a shorter All-Star break. We played a doubleheader in Houston, the first game out of it, and then flew overnight to Baltimore and played in Baltimore. So we played 3 games in 24 hours in separate time zones. And that just doesn't happen anywhere else. So when you see a lot of these Japanese players, they've played on this extremely specific schedule. They pitch once a week. They have total control over when their bullpens happen. And you ask any one of your college guys that gets to pro ball, like going from a 7-day rotation to a 5-day, it's an adjustment, right? And teams have they tried to do the piggyback approach. Some of them go to a 6-day for a period. Some of them go to the 5-day with shorter outings. Like building up starters on a shorter rotation is a really hard thing. And we also know like there are a lot of like veteran pitchers that don't want their routines to be turned upside down. If there are younger pitchers that need more rest, like it's a very hard thing to get everybody on different schedules. But I think that's one of the things that we see with a lot of these Japanese pitchers is they can recover just fine on 7 days. But the second you put them into a 5-day, things get tricky. And actually, if you look at some of the guys that have come over, it hasn't just been 7 days. There are times when they're going like 8-9 days between outings. So there's a lot of, I think, training and not necessarily competing that's mixed into that calendar, and it makes for a very different adjustment when they come over here.
As I think about kind of the big ticket item right now, I think a lot of people are talking about is the issue with velocity, right? Obviously, Tommy John surgeries. You mentioned my podcast with Dr. Meister, and one of the things that he and I kind of talked about was, it's this little bit of like what came first, the chicken or the egg thing. Like I think from a youth baseball's perspective, they're looking at these major league organizations. They're looking at the trends, right? And they're chasing the velo because obviously the velo has gone up in the big leagues. But then I can also see issues from the reverse side, which is these major league organizations who are now drafting these young kids who are now injured coming into pro ball. So it's that Spider-Man meme where it's like everybody's pointing at each other.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I think about. And I try to, just talk about solutions. Like what could some potential solutions be? And on Dr. Meister's podcast, I go, one of the things that I've noticed with a lot of these kids who are 13, 14, 15, as they're like developing how they want to throw and how often they want to throw, they don't ever think about like, do you know what it looks like to have Tommy John surgery? Do you know the amount of time that you're going to miss? Do you know what that road looks like? And I would go so far as to say kids intentionally don't know because they don't want to fill their head with the fear of like what this ultimately could be creating. And I'm not saying that this solution is like the right one. It's just an idea that I had where it's like, look, I think something has to change. There needs to be an awakening on some level because I'm a little afraid that like we're going to get to a place and MLB is eventually going to be like, all right, wait a second. We got a serious problem. Let's hit the panic button now and like come up with some fix. I do think this is something that everybody's aware of. And you may know, because you're obviously in this space, you could be working on things with guys every day to combat this stuff. And I'm curious from your perspective, how has what you've done changed in the last, I know on your last podcast, you actually talked about another study, which was comparing, fastball velocity from 2002 to 2022 and how crazy it's gotten. So this is a long-winded way of me saying, with your expertise, Eric, like what are you maybe doing a little bit differently today than you did when you started?
Yeah. And so a lot of different ways to go with this answer, but I would say back when we started, the yearly calendar was dictated for us. It was perfectly set up for development, if we're being honest. Like it was, play multiple sports, like the weather kind of impacted. And I still think that's the case with a lot of warm weather pitchers now. But I think that's our job as an industry. If we just try to fix the big leagues, honestly, it's like trying to put Band-Aids on an open wound, right? We're just running room to room with buckets, trying to fix all the holes in the roof instead of going up and patching the roof. So I think the play is, if I'm talking industry wide, I've been a long-standing, even before I was in professional baseball, I've said very publicly that I think MLB needs to get far more involved on the youth side of things. I think they need to, basically have very specific scouting windows. Like I think it's absurd that 30 major league teams have all their scouts out to see guys in November. Like, it just shouldn't be happening, because all it does is put more pressure on the amateurs. Like, that should be a scouting dead period that can all be restarted once January rolls around, as they get ready to go see college players prior to that season. But I don't think we should be scouting kids in the fall. There's nothing a 17-year-old kid is going to show you, at an event in October or November, that is going to give you information beyond what you would get in the spring scouting them as they're seniors in high school. And if anything, I think it creates a terrible developmental dynamic. So I've been really adamant that I think that's something that should be in place. And I think also on the legislative side of things is enforcement. Like, we have these pitch count regulations. They get violated at every single travel ball tournament. High school baseball actually has done a decent job. I think every state now, I know it was 49 out of the 50 at one point, had pitch count guidelines. I think adopting some of that stuff is important. And all that's just literally to set the guardrails. Like, we know people are still going to drive way too fast. They're going to drive recklessly, all this stuff. But at least if you have some guardrails to prevent them from, getting too off to the side, like, I think that does make a big difference. So industry wide, those are two of my big circumstances, because all that does is that determines who gets in the door, right? So it gives us a larger body of players that aren't broken by 18 that ultimately get to college or professional baseball. The other thing I'll say that may work in our favor is, I think, as much as the whole NIL transfer portal stuff has been very, very challenging, it's going to send a lot more players to college baseball. Unless MLB massively bumps up, and you can speak this language way better than I can, but unless MLB, really, really bumps up the slotting system, the pool money, more and more players are just going to go to college. So I think the drafts are going to be far more college players who are physically more mature. But this is something nobody's talked about. All these 18-year-old kids that signed and then blew out in pro ball, they're going to blow out in college now. Like, while they're trying to build more capacity and develop, they're actually going to get there. College is going to get a lot more of those. There's going to be the 10 or 12 really, really good high school arms that still sign, in the first couple rounds. But I don't think we're going to see high school kids sign in the 7th round much anymore. Kids who just didn't want to go to college. The money incentives are getting to be too high to actually go in college. So I do think that we'll probably see more injuries in the college game. We'll see a little bit of an older minor league setup. It'll probably be maybe a little bit more of like an international emphasis at the lower levels, alongside with some of those college players, that support them. But I just don't think we're going to see nearly as many 18-year-old kids blowing out in their first year in pro ball, just because the numbers are going to go down. So with that said, colleges better be ready. I hope they're ready to hire better athletic trainers, get more nutrition resources, getting a manual therapy, things like that, because that would have been the alternative that they probably would have gotten when they went to pro ball. So those are kind of my industry wide solutions. Those are obviously very, very big rocks to move, but I do think they're things that we can do to kind of help get the needle moving in the right direction.
I couldn't agree with you more about the transition to guys going to college more than signing. I think what's going to ultimately start to happen, and it's even started to happen this season, is like, you're going to have the elite high school players sign, but the majority of other guys, I agree, they're going to go to college. And what's interesting about what that would present is, in a sense, it almost feels like then college could almost take on this role of like how MLB was with the injury stuff, where it's like, okay, wait a second, we're now seeing this influx. Now let's make some adjustments. And then there's going to be a lag time there, right? Where it's going to take a little bit of time for things to correct itself.
Remember, Tommy John's, it's 14 months plus or minus 6 or 8 weeks is the timeline. 14 months is a long time, right? And we both know college coaches are not nearly as loyal to the players as the players are to the college coaches. So if you're a kid that rolls in at SEC school, whatever, and you blow out in fall ball in your first year and you're not there in the spring, or you blow out in the spring, you don't have a guaranteed place for that second year. We both know all these college relationships now are 1-year engagements, and people are popping.
Yeah, especially with the transfer portal.
Yeah. So here's the challenge: is when these guys blow out, and instead of having a consistent major league organization that's going to watch over them, instead you're going to get a kid that's rehabbing in the private sector, trying to figure out his next step. I can see that happening a lot because there's roster limitations in college baseball. There's no 60-day IL in the college setting. So these are going to be really, really challenging things that I think the industry as a whole has to navigate. But maybe college protects them a little bit more because it's a 7-day rotation and stuff like that, not as many games. But I think we're in for an interesting couple of years ahead with all these changes.
Well, and the more players from high school that are going to college, those guys are now going to have an opportunity to develop differently than they would if they were in pro ball, right?
So,
I think a lot of times everybody looks at the development in college versus development in pro ball, and it's like it's one and the same. And I don't even know that you can compare the two. It is vastly different.
yeah.
Just from the mental side for these players, you go to pro ball and you're signed, and it's like on some level, there's always a sense of urgency, I think, for everybody. But on some level, it's like, hey, man, take your time. Let's develop. Let's do it the right way. Where in college, and I'm not pointing the finger at college, I think it's just the nature of the business. Hey, man, what have you done for me lately? Like, we got to go. We don't have the luxury of just taking it easy.
Yeah, exactly. And
right.
So a lot better pitching in, the SEC tournament on ESPN than you might, develop from a competitive standpoint playing in a Florida State League game with, 20 people in the stands in July. So there's perks and drawbacks, I think, to both experiences. And it all depends on the kid. But, to your point, like 30 major league organizations, countless colleges, they all take different approaches. So each kid has to figure out what they need and match it up. Because I know, being an organization myself, we're very different than the other 29. Like I know what we do very, very well and how our experience for young players is differentiated. And I'm sure every college that you talk to, every pro sports organization you talk to would feel the same way.
So I want to get into, I'm a big fan of the studies, man. I called you Andrew Huberman, we got to get into them a little bit. So I want to mention one other study that you talked about on this podcast. So, and actually, I don't even think it was a study. I think you just pulled this up on Fangraphs, actually, now that I'm looking at it. But in 2002, the average four-seam fastball velocity was 89.0. In 2022, it increased to 93.6, right? So what is that? A 4.6 increase over the 20-year period. Mm-hmm. The usage went from 64.4 in 2002 down to 49.1 in 2022. So what's interesting about that is despite the fact that velocity is obviously increasing, the usage of the four-seam fastball is decreasing. Now, I think if we can generalize or just make assumptions, I think analytics probably has something to do with that, right? There's more information available to these organizations. And so if you have somebody who looks like they would, perform better against a certain pitcher or vice versa, like they're obviously going to take all that into account. But I'm curious from your perspective now being in pro ball, with what you do for the Yankees. Do you see this just on a game by game basis? Like as you, not as like a strength coach, but as someone who's just watching the game, like, are you seeing this happen in real time?
Yeah, maybe not in real time, but definitely year to year. I'll say this. People have no idea how hard it is to hit a baseball in the major leagues right now. Like what Aaron Judge is doing is incredible. I remember distinctly, you remember when the McGuire and Sosa documentary kind of came out? It was kind of like after the Jordan documentary. So it was always like the hot button topic when guys came into the gym the next day. Did you see the episode? And like, I was like, hey, what'd you think of that? And everybody's like, those guys threw so slow. Like those were cookies. And it was, the guys were obviously hitting home runs at a crazy high level. But what happened is as velocity increased, hitters had to correct, right? They had to train against velo more often. So people don't realize the downstream effects of lots of velocity, right? More velocity, obviously more hit by pitches, right? Guys selling out for velo. But also when hitters have to train for it more, like they're cranking up velo in the cages, you see more guys that get blown up and miss a month with a bad thumb. You see more oblique strains when guys get fooled in the cages. So a lot more random practice, particularly in like the era of traject where guys are, they're getting the 2,000 extra plate appearances a year in the cages instead of just hitting off a tee and doing flips. We're seeing way more wrist stuff as guys are competing more and more against high level arms, because it's not just that they're throwing the fastball harder. It's that a lot of them have two fastballs. They've got a cutter, the sliders are harder, and that's why the usage has gone down, is the pitch design revolution has really opened up possibility of guys developing big time outlier pitches very, very quickly, which can be dangerous as well if you try to integrate a new pitch really, really fast. Like if you learn a sweeper and you're throwing it at a 30% clip 2 months later, like you are absolutely exposed. Even if that pitch is perfectly designed for your delivery, your arm slot, all that, it's new, right? If you or I,
Right.
I always use the analogy of like Lance Armstrong. He was best cyclist in the world. He retires and he takes up running, and he's kind of like an average marathoner. And he said the New York Marathon was the hardest physical thing he ever did. It's just a completely different experience. So you've got to get out and gradually integrate this stuff. But hitting is really, really hard right now. Pitching is very stressful. To your point about that 4 point whatever percent increase it was, there was one study that showed that with each average mile per hour increase in velocity, you get about a 15% risk increase in UCL injuries. So you're at I think you said 4.6. That's a 60% increased risk of elbow, but then layer thoracic outlet, shoulder, all these other things that can kind of creep up. The number of like blisters and finger issues, are all changing as well. So it's a very tough time to keep pitchers healthy when they're competing at that level.
So you've worked with some incredible, I think all different sports, but some incredible baseball players, especially at least the ones that I'm familiar with. And I look at, there's two guys that come to mind when I think about like pitching and durability. And, obviously both of these guys are on the tail end of their career, but if you look at the majority of their career, like these guys were the guys that were they were staying healthy every single year. And it was Verlander and Scherzer, right? And I'm curious to get your opinion on, what do you think that was from? Is that, and I think you may have even mentioned this at some point, which is these guys maybe having the ability to throw a fastball at a certain velocity or above a certain velocity, but being able to like scale it back when it's called upon. Do you attribute some of their durability and their success to that? Or what would you say that's from maybe?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's probably layers to their durability and obviously their success over an extended period of time. Like those guys are very, very different. Like, obviously delivery wise, like Max is a very low slot, uses vertical approach angle. Justin's a very high slot, and it might be the highest in baseball still. So they're different in how they have to go about it. And I think they appreciate that. Like, certain guys aren't going to be able to throw certain pitches. I think when I look at Justin, like, what's made him stand the test of time. Like, don't get me wrong, he was blessed with some generational arm speed, but I give him so much credit for always being able to reinvent himself. He's done it multiple times over the course of his career, whether it was, after his core muscle surgery many years ago, or when he went to Houston and went all in on four seams instead of the two seam he was throwing a lot. So I think he's always been extremely open-minded and incredibly critical of himself. Like nothing is ever perfect. He always wants to be working on something. So I think there's an element of that's made him very, very successful. Max just understands how to compete better than anybody I've ever met. He finds competition in everything. I know he's a big Michael Jordan fan. You watch like the Last Dance documentary, there's a whole lot of Max Scherzer in there. If you actually understand kind of how it goes, like, I think I often joke with Max, like when you retire from baseball, you're going to be the guy that's like playing pickup hoops at the local Y and getting into fights with guys.
Right.
You have so much competitive instinct that has to be channeled elsewhere. So, and obviously Max is like really, really like refined his routine over the years and kind of how he attacks guys and has developed different things. He added a curveball years ago. And so I think he has a different perspective as well. Neither of those guys are satisfied. They're always trying to find ways to get better. So it's certainly helped me, to grow as a professional, being around them and just listen and learn. But to your point about durability, like, to be honest, I think there's an element of luck involved with everybody, because we don't know what the perfect delivery is. I think those guys tend to be very in tune with their bodies, listening when it whisper instead of waiting for it to yell. I think over the years, we've seen a lot of guys that, the check engine light comes on and they continue to just kind of like push the pedal to the floor. And those guys have had a good awareness about not letting little things become really big things. So that's something that works in their favor. But yeah, I mean, I think probably Justin more so than Max does know how to scale back and then sneak in that big velo, thing. I remember Kurt Schilling talking about, like, I have 2 max effort fastballs in me every single game, and that was back when he was, 97 to 100.
Yeah.
It was not something that he was doing all the time. So yeah, I think they can do that a little bit more, maybe less, as maybe the velo is not the top end stuff that they had, in their heydays, but certainly when they were going in their best, like, you would see, Scherzer live at, 93 to 95, and then he'd show a 98, in a big at bat. And Verlander was obviously very, very similar too. So there's probably something to be said for it, but The problem is the game doesn't reward that right now. The game,
Right.
like they'd rather see you go 5 shutout with 80 pitches, not seeing the third time through the order and being your absolute best because the bullpen is so elite behind you. It's such a weird transitional time for the game right now.
Well, especially with these young kids, you got scouts in the stands. You're not going to throw 91 if you can throw 95.
It's a great point. Like you watch those games too, they're terrible, right? It's 95
Right.
to backstop, and it's not really high quality baseball. The hitters aren't even getting like good at bats because you can't have an approach with a kid who's just trying to throw as hard as he possibly can.
Yeah, I think you and I are old school. We have an appreciation for what the game once was. There's something that drives me nuts, and it's when I see at some of these showcases, they put a radar gun behind first base for the shortstop to throw as hard as he can to first, and I'm just like, there has to be a better way to capture this, right? To capture a player's arm strength. But all right, as we come kind of to the end of this, Eric, I've heard you say before that what makes a player spectacular is also what makes him susceptible. And I think that is such a great point, because as I think about the players who are, let's just say, getting geared up for the draft this coming year, right? Let's say it's a high school kid. What makes him good? Let's just say he has a really good curveball. In high school, that can make him susceptible because guess what his high school coach calls every other pitch? Curveball, right? And so I think it's important for parents to be mindful of just that point. There's no question here, but it's just, I guess praising you on some level for making that point, because I think it's a good one. It's the awareness that matters. And if a parent sees that there's something that their kid does really well, be mindful of, like, instead of just pushing the gas pedal with that one thing, let's think a little bit more about how this could negatively affect them if you actually did that long term.
I think the biggest mistake young players make, and I'm sure you counsel guys on this all the time, it's like you don't have to be everything to everybody all the time. Like there's this assumption that you always have to be ready to showcase all this stuff. Like there's nothing wrong with going off the grid and just training, being a high school kid for a couple months and like actually getting better. Like the job is to create something worth showcasing, not just to showcase all the time. Like I think we lose track of that. And every time you just throw like this, showcase event or high level competitive event in it, it definitely interferes with the plan. So I also, really emphasize to kids, like, if you talk about these, we just talked about some of the best pitchers of all time. Like those guys are, they make 32, 33 starts in a year. There's going to be a couple of clunkers in there, right? That's true of those guys. I mean, that's going to be the case for, Cy Young Award winners every year. There's going to be a couple of bad ones in there. And we put so much pressure on young pitchers to repeat their delivery and be elite every time out. Like there are going to be times when a high school kid who's 93 to 95 walks 6 guys in a game and just can't find it because he's growing, his body's changing. He's trying to figure out how to like hydrate, eat properly, how to sleep properly, how to impart force to a baseball the right way. So I try really, really hard not to put too much pressure on young kids and instead to take this longer term perspective of like, make sure your process is good and your outcomes will be good eventually as well.
Yeah. I mean, the mental side of this game is so important. I know we didn't talk about it a lot today, but I've talked about this on my podcast. It's like, if the game is so mental, you can't completely ignore that side of things, right? Because it goes into the physical component. It goes into how much you train. It goes into, how you think about what your goals are and things like that. So I got one more question for you, man.
Yeah.
And it's an easy one. We've talked about a lot of advice and some things that you have given us today, but I'm curious if you had a son who was 12 years old and he's, getting started in this travel baseball thing, and you had to give him kind of one piece of advice, you could only tell him one thing. What do you think you would lead with? What would that one thing be?
The biggest thing for me is that it has to be fun. Like, I don't know if that's advice. It's like, that's the first question I ask my daughter when I pick her up at gymnastics. Like, did you have a good time? Did you have a good time? What was the best part of your day? Like, those are the questions I ask. Like people that meet their kids at the door after practice and are just like ready to let into them about what didn't go well or the base running mistake they made in the game or something like that. Like the overwhelming majority of our kids are not going to make $100 million playing professional sports. Like the law of averages tells us it's not going to work. But we do want to make sure that we foster a positive lifetime relationship with exercise. We do want to know that they're cultivating really good relationships with their teammates, with their coaches. They're just having really, really good experiences. Like that's what I look back on when I played high school and sports even before that. So, for me, it's about exposing them to a wide variety of social circles, playing multiple sports, and also making sure they have an awesome group of friends, that comes from that. You talked about Huberman. Huberman did a great podcast just about kind of the dangers of social media with young kids and everything like that. And one of the things that they emphasized the absolute most was that friend group is really important, whether it was sports, church participation, whatever it was. It's the people you're around. So like for me, like we go to softball practice with our kids or gymnastics practice with our kids, and yeah, there's a physical component to it, and yeah, it's cool being a sports dad. But for me, it's just as much about the kids that they're hanging out with and the environment we're kind of creating for their longer term development. So yeah, when we have 12-year-olds, that'll be the message. It still has to be fun, and we'll always praise effort over outcome with everything that we do.
Well, that may have been advice for the kids, but I'll tell you that's advice for all of us as well. I mean, honestly, I think we can all get so caught up in the serious nature of life, and we all lose sight in whatever it is that you do, right? Like, enjoy the fact that you get to pick your kid up from school, even though it may be a hassle. Enjoy it. And not to get sentimental, but I think it's truly an important point, because we can all just get so bogged down with everything needing to be perfect or everything needing to work a certain way. And it's like, wait a second, let's take a beat, take a deep breath and recognize like, hey, we got one life, enjoy it. So
days are long, years are short is what I always say.
Exactly.
I'll lose those days.
So Eric, I'm going to give everybody in the show notes a way to get in contact with your organization. I think you've provided a ton of good info today. Brother, I can't thank you enough. This has been awesome. So thank you.
Appreciate you taking the time. This was fun.